Hello, everyone. Welcome to Promethean Action's live question and answer show. My name is Adam Sturman. I'm a producer here with Promethean Action and Promethean Pack. Welcome, everyone, to the 250th anniversary show, 250th anniversary of the United States Promethean Action show. Welcome, everyone, for joining us. Today's show is called America Turns 250. The court reshapes the presidency as Iran holds. And we're going to be talking about all of this today. As people are joining the stream, please drop us a like and let us know where you're watching from. I'm going to open up today's show with something that I think many of you saw this already, but this was posted about 10, 11 hours ago last night on Truth Social. And this morning, when everyone woke up, this was making the rounds. So let me play this. It's about a minute and a half. It's absolutely hilarious.
Have you or someone you know been diagnosed with TDS? The symptoms can be relentless. Fortunately, I'm Dr. Trump, and I have a treatment plan. Let's hear what some of my patients have to say.
I have been suffering for over a decade, and after listening to Dr. Trump, I can see some results.
Man, I've been suffering for years. I really didn't believe that was help out there. That was when I came across this video on TV.
I really thought I was a lost cause. This was gonna affect me for the rest of my life. But after using the treatment plan, I can see a difference.
I really wasn't sure I could help some of these people. They were so far gone, I wasn't really sure.
I had no idea how much this was affecting my life. My work is slowed down. I'm hardly recognizable anymore. I just needed help.
I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. Constantly angry. I made everyone miserable around me.
I feel like I've aged 20 years in the last 2 years. I've been so concerned. I was really starting to worry about my future.
The treatment is simple. Turn off fake news. Say your prayers, and if you ever feel anxious, just have a Diet Coke like me, and you're going to see a remarkable difference in your life.
I think that that's actually really good advice. Tune out the fake news. That's truly excellent advice. Okay, but more seriously, I'm going to open up now with the main discussion that I saw and Barbara and Susan saw, which is the fight over birthright citizenship. So I'm going to play these two other clips just to set the stage, and then Barbara and Susan will take it from here. So let me just play these two clips here just to get started here.
It was the most important, and we want some others too. It was the most important decision of all of them, I think. But we'll take care of the birthright citizenship, because that was not meant for rich people from other countries. That was meant for, actually, it was meant for the babies of slaves. If you look at it, it was a month after the Civil War ended that it went through. That's because it was meant for the babies of slaves. It wasn't meant for rich people from China. They came over in Gulf Streams. It was meant for the babies of slaves. So I believe, no, I know they got it wrong, but that's okay, because they gave us something that nobody thought. But they also gave us something in one of the sessions a year ago. It was called merit. Our country now is based again on merit.
And then JD Vance also had a bunch of clips. Let me play this one here. I thought this was a pretty good one too.
Gets the benefits of American citizenship.
Oh, why didn't
I
anyone
don't think
tell
that's
me?
what the framers of the 15th Amendment had in mind.
Hold on.
Some conservatives are angry with Justice Amy Coney Barrett. Are you one of them?
Well, look, do I think she made a mistake in the ruling? I do. I don't know how anybody can say that if a person who is an illegal alien, or a person, for example, who's pregnant and comes to the United States on a vacation, they have a baby, and all of a sudden their entire family gets the benefits of American citizenship. I don't think that's what the framers of the 14th Amendment had in mind. I don't think it's the right case. But look, it was 5-4. Sometimes the Supreme Court makes mistakes. We're going to try to correct that mistake, but nobody's perfect, including the Supreme Court.
So if anyone is curious as to what J.D. Vance is referring to when he's talking about correcting the Supreme Court ruling on
So Barbara and Susan.
Well, let me start. Barbara's going to get into, some of the specifics in terms of the Supreme Court ruling, but I want to focus on something that, both President Trump and Vice President Vance said. They both said basically they got it wrong. They made a mistake. And I think it's important for people to locate some of these Supreme Court decisions, because this obviously isn't the only one. They did it with the tariff question a couple of months ago. I think it's important to recognize that here we are 2 days before the 250th anniversary of our Declaration of Independence, which launched a revolution against the British imperial system, which we are still fighting today. Especially in regards to critical things like legal theory, our culture, what has happened to our economy. That is, over the last decades, I would submit probably over about the last 125 years, we have been increasingly occupied by British ideas, whether it's legal theories, whether it's cultural things, whether it is an economic system which rejected the American system of political economy and literally wrote it out of our history for 125 years, that the very principles of the American Revolution, while they're politically, I think, in the forefront of people's minds, I think there are other aspects to it which people have not thought through. As Scott Bessent said in a speech a little while ago on the economy, things that used to be instinctual were basically thrown out the window. And the problem, I think, is because they were only instinctual. And I think what this administration is doing on economic policy, on cultural policy, and what this really addresses is the question of legal policy, is continuing the American Revolution, or bringing the American revolutionary ideas to bear in these areas of our public life where we have essentially lost the consciousness of what the principles of our American Revolution are. Donald Trump is carrying out a revolution, a thorough revolution, in strategic policy, in economic policy, in cultural policy. And I think the question of legal policy is the one you kind of have to drag along. So that being said, if we are thinking in these kinds of revolutionary terms and recognize what this administration is doing, I would just counsel people, do not expect the Supreme Court to lead a revolution. By nature, by the way our separation of powers is set up, the Supreme Court is the institution that moves the slowest. Our founding fathers intended that. They wanted this dialogue between the different institutions of government. The presidency, which is elected by the entire population and is elected every 4 years. The Congress, which is elected by a small part of a state, which is elected every 2 years. The Senate, which is elected by a whole state every 6 years. And then courts, which have much longer cycles, especially the Supreme Court, because of the way the founding fathers set it up. They wanted to create that kind of tension and that kind of dialogue between different sectors of the economy representing different timeframes and different parts of the American people. And through that dialogue, if guided by the proper principles, the principles enshrined in our Declaration of Independence, you would come out with the right policies. And sometimes it might not be immediate. And as I say, because of the way our founding fathers set up, especially the Supreme Court question, It is the institution that moves the slowest. So I would just put forward this proposition on July 2nd, 2 days before the 4th of July. We have to think in very revolutionary terms, as this president does. But again, don't lose too much sleep over the fact that the institution which moves the slowest, namely the Supreme Court, is not necessarily leading the charge in terms of the American Revolution. And again, if you listen to what both JD and the president said, you know, we're gonna figure out how to deal with this. If not immediately, then certainly in the medium term. And then I would add one other thing before I turn it over to Barbara. You know, we are facing a critical midterm election. I was speaking with a fellow activist here in Michigan earlier at the end of last week, and I was talking about the urgency of the midterm elections, which we all understand that we cannot lose the House or the Senate. We have to ensure that the president can drive forward with his revolution, and we have to give him the people who will do this. And the gentleman who spoke after me said, well, I have to disagree with Susan on one thing. I don't call it a midterm. I call it a final exam. And I think it's a very good concept because it makes clear there is a lot, there is everything riding on what we are facing come November. And that whatever the lay of the land, whether we have all the rulings and decisions that we want on questions of election integrity and other issues that are being thrown at us by the Supreme Court, whatever the lay of the land, we still have to figure out how to win. So that's how I would open it up. And I know Barbara has some very precise things to say about this birthright citizen question.
Yeah, well, I'm going to be a little bit tougher on the court than Susan. Basically, I think
I didn't mean to not be tough.
Okay, but she's got the right perspective, all right. And the idea of the founders was the judicial branch is supposed to be the weakest branch, and the dynamic we're now seeing, all right, is a problem because the Congress is largely absent. In other words, the idea you have a tension between the president trying to get things done, the courts, which are acting almost as an insurrectionary force at this point, trying to sabotage everything he's doing, and the Congress just sitting there saying, I don't know what to do. What is the leadership function which we have to address as we look at the midterms, which are critical for that very reason. We're electing a Congress. And we're electing a Congress which will or will not act on our nature's future. And that's where we have to put all of our energies and all of our emotions at this point. That said, John Roberts is a disaster in terms of the 250th anniversary of the United States. It's not Amy Coney Barrett. I mean, she's just a law professor who's going to follow whatever her law professor instinct says. She's got no feet in the present fights in the United States. She's off there somewhere in her lofty scholarship about textualism and all this other nonsense. John Roberts, on the other hand, authored a decision which is literally futile. And that's what Clarence Thomas says in his dissent. What he says is that whether or not you are a citizen goes back to the principles of common law in England. Okay, get that. In England, where who was a subject of the king was literally based on the land that they inhabited at that point in time. So if you're coming from abroad and you touch down here in the United States and you have a baby, guess what? You're a citizen under what Roberts says, but you're not really a citizen, you're a subject. And that's the point I want to make about what Roberts is actually saying. He's not defining citizenship. He's talking about being a subject. Clarence Thomas takes him to the outhouse on that, literally, and, essentially, rips him apart in 90 pages of absolute constitutional scholarship on something which matters a whole lot to Clarence Thomas, namely the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. For our international audience, in case you don't know what that means, the 14th Amendment came into being after the Civil War, as Trump talks about. It came into being specifically to overturn the Dred Scott decision of the very same Supreme Court of the United States, which said Black people aren't citizens because they are an inferior race and can never qualify as citizens of the United States. And essentially, the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act, which were passed at the same time after the Civil War about this very issue, resulted, as Frederick Douglass wrote constantly, and Clarence Thomas cites Frederick Douglass throughout his decision, we are citizens because we are Americans. We have decided to stay here. We have the intention of staying here, despite the fact that we didn't come here. We came here as captives. We adopted the culture of the United States of America. We are citizens because we believe in that culture. So think about that contrast. Clarence Thomas, the Black person, essentially coming up and schooling this Harvard-educated jerk about, essentially what the meaning of the 14th Amendment is, while all of these people who are of Robert's liberal persuasion are running around talking about the United States being inherently racist. This was the reckoning. A million or more people died in the Civil War over this issue. And for Roberts to be going back to common law and the king to define what is a citizen of the United States is, as Clarence Thomas said, the height of feudalism. Has nothing to do with what the United States is or its constant discovery of, the perfection of its institutions in the form of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Does it get fixed? It can be readily fixed. Even Harry Reid, good old Harry Reid, the Democrat leader, actually had a law which died in committee outlawing this type of what is being called trafficking in citizenship, when people just fly over here in Learjets, have babies from China, and actually become citizens. And think about that. There's about 1.5 million of those people, of that category of people right now, probably coming on the voter rolls of the United States of America because of this. Congress has to fix it, just like they have to fix the mail-in ballot issue. All right, you can't resolve these things through the courts. You can sometimes get things done. Think about the other decision from this week, which was, the old idea from the Roosevelt administration. All right, get that. Talk about a court moving slow. From the Roosevelt administration, that the president, who heads the executive branch, can't fire employees from agencies which the Congress sets up, the so-called fourth branch of government, or the administrative agencies. Finally, again, stressing Susan's point, this week the court said, actually, these guys are in the executive branch of the government, so the president has the ability to fire them. That's the best thing that came out of the court this week, because now this whole kind of insurrectionist mess, which is the administrative agencies, come under the direct control of the White House, and the president can fire these people at will. So I think that's how I take it. I can't help myself. I loved what Clarence Thomas did. Everybody who wants an education in terms of what the 14th Amendment is really about should read that 90-page dissent. You can go to the Supreme Court website. It's up there. It's basically called something versus Barber, and I take it very personally, is the name of the case. But, you'll find it up there. And I think that kind of answers the question.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Susan. And thank you to everyone who's joining us on YouTube and X.com. If you've been tracking us on YouTube now, drop us a like. On X.com, give us a quick share. Thank you, everyone. And I need to give an extra special shout out here to Mother of Pearl with a very generous super chat. Happy 250th America. Thank you all, Promethean Action, for all you do to educate the masses. God bless Promethean Action. God bless America. Thank you, everyone. We're going to bring, hopefully the goal here is over time to bring liberty to the entire planet, not with our guns, but through diplomacy, and bring a world where we actually have nations working together for the common goal of maybe taking mankind somewhere deeper into the universe. You know, I've been thinking about that a lot. Are there really aliens out there? Some of that footage that's being released, if that is actually real, some of that footage is incredible, absolutely crazy stuff. So I think it's kind of maybe lighting up people's imaginations that there actually is some reason for us to like say hi to these other people that are, I don't know how they're coming here to travel to see us. Thank you very much, Mother of Pearl, and thank you everyone for joining us. Let me say some more thanks before we move on here. And here, let me do this. While I'm saying doing some super chats, I'm going to start this poll. Let's see how that shows up next. All right, so people can vote. I don't know if that comes up. Oh yeah, so it says type 1, 2, or 3 in the chat. So people can actually vote on that. What topic should we be covering next? I think that's showing up on the screen there. Okay, so I want to say thank you. I guess I can't have that up at the same time, unfortunately. We need Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito T-shirt ASAP. Well, I don't know if we're going to go that far yet, but we understand. We understand where you're coming from. Barbara, you want to make any comments on that one?
Well, isn't it ironic, you know, basically, if you think about Clarence Thomas's trajectory, you know, he is probably the guy on the Supreme Court who right now understands the most about the Constitution. Alito is very sharp, don't get me wrong. But in terms of actually speaking to the character of the Constitution itself, he has been a real bear. And the issue of who comes next clearly has to be in that framework, the Alito-Thomas framework. So that's basically how I put it.
Thank you, Barbara. Okay, let me say thank you to Melody Hart. Good morning, Dream Team, where you get real cutting edge news analysis. Thank you so much. We really try hard. Leslie in crazy Seattle, thank you for joining us again, Leslie. Thank you for your devotion to our wonderful, beloved country. Happy 4th of July. Thank you very much. And David Gray, thank you, brother, for joining us again. Let's take one of his quick questions here. U.S. loves World Cup Brits. Buy Greenland and we'll move there. Build more breweries. Okay. U.S. loves World Cup Brits. Buy Greenland and we'll move there. Build more breweries. I will say, I mean, maybe it was because the World Cup was held in the Americas this year in the United States. But I personally noticed there was a lot of good vibes in the bars and the restaurants of people that were watching the World Cup. It actually was a lot of fun. It drew people, supporters from all over the world were watching. So yeah, I saw that firsthand. Happy 4th of July tomorrow. I claim free tea for all the reparations for Boston Harbor. Dem switching side. What's motivating them? Barbara and Susan, your thoughts on that one? I think that's super important.
Well, one of the things that's motivating them is you have a completely batshit crazy wing, which is now coming out of the closet, which is the Democratic Socialist / Communists. You know, this has been there, but with the electoral victories recently, I think a lot of people are sitting there and saying, okay, this is too far. And whatever I may think about Donald Trump, I am not going to this destruction of our nation, which, as Barbara made clear in her discussion the other day, as Mike Steger made clear in his recent discussion as well on his YouTube channel, you know, the intention of this wing of it's not a wing of the Democratic Party. The intention of this insurrectionary force inside the United States is to destroy Western Christian civilization. It's to destroy our Constitution and destroy our country. So as I say, there's a lot of libs there in the middle, who can't stand Donald Trump and can't stand this, but they are not ready to go to that completely nihilist destruction of everything our civilization has represented. I think that's what's driving it. And then there's a more positive side, because I think as President Trump's economic revolution continues to gather steam, where you see more of the jobs actually emerging. Right now, we see it with construction jobs because they're building the factories, but pretty soon you're going to see it in terms of the factory workers. Those people tend to be blue collar Democrats. And I think, there's the positive side of this, which is the restoration of a truly American, as J.D. Vance said the other day, economic developmental policy, as opposed to Milton Friedman's laissez-faire, anything goes. I think that is going to recruit, a whole new layer of people permanently into Donald Trump's Republican Party. So I think that's part of what's going on.
Thank you very much, Susan. Barbara, any thoughts on the Democrats, the new position of well, actually, this really kind of fracturing now. You have the DSA on one side, and then I guess you have this the other Dems that are like, no, we want to be more like Trump. What are your thoughts on that whole phenomenon?
Well, the difference is kind of like the old British division between the communists outright, which is what the DSA is, and the socialists like the Webbs and the Fabian Society and Tony Blair and all these other people. So, a lot of these Democratic so-called people, incumbents who are sitting, who got defeated so far by the socialists, were all on board for the most part with the World Economic Forum, the whole, open borders, all of that stuff agenda. What they now have a choice about is, are you for the destruction of the United States of America? And that's what the choice is. And they better damn well have the guts to actually say what it smokes all of them out. It causes them to actually have to say what they're for and why. And it causes them, which I think is the fundamental question, which is posed by both the Supreme Court decision and by this insurrection, is what is it that we're American citizens? What is it that we should require to say we're American citizens? What is it that makes us American? And I think it's very clear when you look at how, Scott Bessent has been defining it. We're and Donald Trump, in my most recent video, I actually put that video at the end, the outsiders who invent the world, the outsiders whose mission in life is to actually make a difference for the good for all of humanity. That's what we've been. We've made a lot of mistakes along the way. We've come under foreign powers like the British Empire, and really gotten corrupted over the last 50 years or so. But that's what's reemerging now. The great innovators using our creativity to build new things and go new places and explore new frontiers on behalf of all of mankind. So you wake up, you're like a kid. You wake up every morning and you're excited because you got a mission in life. You're building a world in which that your children's world is going to be a better place. And that's what the American system is about. That's the difference with the British system, and that's the difference with the way that the British system has actually been incorporated into the World Economic Forum and that whole thing, which was called the Great Reset under Biden, and that whole incredible destruction of the country. So that's how I'd really put it. And it's a very interesting thing to watch, and I think we have to call them out at every opportunity. Are you seeking the overthrow of the government in the United States? How do you define the government in the United States? And, who are you in this battle for our country? And I think if we do that in a substantive way, you're going to see a kind of American reflex arise in the population, which is going to help us out a whole lot.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, David, for joining us. I got some other. I got a super chat here that really made me smile. But before I do that, let me just show. So here's the outcome of the Here's the outcome of the poll. Overwhelming majority want us to talk about Islam and the Muslim Brotherhood. So what we're going to do is we're going to keep on the theme of the judiciary, because I think that's the super big theme this week, and then we'll get to the other issues here. So thank you everyone for voting in that little poll there. Probably start doing that more frequently. Okay, so let me start with this one here, and then I'm going to start taking questions from our email newsletter that is on, again, the Supreme Court, election integrity, and the birthright citizenship. Okay, so Kevin has a question, has a comment here. Fix birthright citizenship by banning pregnant foreigners, allow foreign women only a 3-month visa bonded, and speed up the return of all legal immigrants, end H-1B visas, and end student visas. Thank you, Kevin, for your comment. And I'm going to pull in here some other questions. So these questions are coming from our email newsletter supporters. If you don't already know this, we have an email newsletter, we have a daily email newsletter, and a weekly email newsletter. If you want to stay in contact with us, if you like what you're seeing and want to stay in contact, please get our email newsletter. The link is in the description. So that's where these slide questions are coming from. So Victoria says, the Supreme Court decision on birthright citizenship is upsetting. The left is crowing because they allege that only a constitutional amendment, a near impossibility given the division in Congress and the country, can change this. President Trump disagrees and thinks Congress can legislate a fix. What is your analysis of this problem? Is there a path to a good outcome? Thank you, Victoria. Next question is from Larry. 2 huge setback decisions from the Supreme Court: birthright citizenship, late mail-in ballots being accepted. These are issues that are an immediate gift to the commies that are well on their way to taking control of our country. Much more of an immediate fire to fight than the empire's failing attempts at skullduggery and easily handed trans invasion of women's sports. The president's authority to fire unelected bureaucrats was a good decision, and the thought of Dems crying over here, that warms my heart. I would like to see Promethean focus on items 1 and 2. These are items that are not only worthy of compromise and serious enough to cause patriots to consider violence. Okay. Thank you very much, Larry, for your comments and concerns. And I have one here for Christy for these 3. It is possible one or more of our Supreme Court justices have been compromised by the imperial deep state. I'm so disappointed by some of their, in my opinion, illogical rulings, especially recently. Thank you for all you do. You have certainly opened my eyes, my husband and I. Your explanations make it all make sense. Thank you very much, Christy. Barbara and Susan, your thoughts on the Supreme Court issues?
Well, I think we sort of, led with answering some of these questions. And as I said before, I think that the birthright tourism issue can be solved very readily by just, having the Congress institute Harry Reid's proposal, which banned that kind of thing. That takes care of that one. It doesn't require a constitutional amendment. The far more serious issue is the one raised by Judge Kavanaugh in his dissent. What if immigrants come here illegally, have babies, and say they want to stay because they want to become Americans? And I think the president's entire immigration policy, it already takes care of that. No, everybody who comes here illegally has to be deported, and you can come back at some future point legally entering our country. That is the answer to that. It's already being implemented. The next question, however, is far more serious. It's the one I raised, which is, what does it mean? How do we define being an American citizen, which overlaps somewhat with the questions being asked about Muslims? What kind of requirement do we put on immigrants to assure that they're not coming here essentially as a block not to become Americans, as Frederick Douglass argued, but instead to maintain their own culture, say they hate America, and say they basically are just going to subsist here somehow, but they reject everything we have in our country as a guiding principle. That's a very different story. And we have a problem in that area. It's not going to get fixed by a court. We have a problem in our education system, and we have a problem in our own citizenry, which doesn't adequately understand what it means to be an American. Would you right now, and the stuff that's being put out about this tells us that we have something of a crisis here. Would you be willing to give your life for this country right now if you were asked by the commander-in-chief to go to war? Many, many, many of the people who are here as Americans would answer that question, no. They would say, not if we're supporting Israel, okay? This, that, or the other in terms of the various things that actually are floating out there on social media. We have to really take this July 4th, 250 years to heart in terms of going back, reading the Declaration of Independence, understanding the context, reading the Constitution, understanding it. And, you can put in a civics education component to our schools, which ensure that people actually understood why all these people died for this country before us. Why do we have a civil war? Why was bloodshed over actually keeping this country as a nation under this form of law, not the form of law of the rule of law nonsense, but the actual Constitution and Declaration of Independence. And I think that's part and parcel what we've got to get back to here. Is why people are so easily snookered by social media and what comes up, and don't think through the consequences of what they're saying. I think you have to basically think about legislation which says in order to become a citizen, you've got to swear that oath, which people do when they go through immigration, but you actually and you got to pass the test, which has gotten a lot easier. It used to be pretty damn hard. You've got to pass the test in terms of really understanding this culture and saying you accept this culture. It doesn't mean you can't keep parts of the old culture. Believe me, I love Italian cooking. I love Chinese cooking. I love all of that stuff. I love going to restaurants where everybody's doing that stuff. That's all great and terrific. But those people actually want to be Americans. Okay, I want to be an American. And as Clarence Thomas points out, by citing Frederick Douglass and citing the whole real battle over slavery, not the BS circulated in the 1619 Project. That's what we really have to think through and get clear in our heads.
Thank you, Barbara. Susan, any comments on the Supreme Court? We have another set on the Save America Act coming soon.
Right. No, I just want to highlight the overall point that Barbara made, because in my opening remarks, I wasn't trying to leave the Supreme Court off the hook. I'm addressing it from the standpoint of what is it you can actually do? Because we can all be as pissed as we want to be at Justice Roberts. But the question is, what on July 2nd, 2026, can you as an American citizen do about that? Well, I don't think you can probably get rid of him anytime soon, not as a single American citizen. So the question is, we have institutions which are compromised. We have institutions which are contaminated. We obviously have very problematic people sitting in positions of power throughout the United States. So again, what is the question of what you can do about it? And I think what Barbara just raised is very fundamental in terms of the question of what is the guiding founding principle of the American Revolution? Because I think what people can do about it is to help us spread the real power of the American Republic to more people in different ways. And by that, I mean the basic difference between our republic and Christian and other societies versus empire. Because our republic is based on the understanding that there is a creator, that the creator embeds laws within the universe. This is nature and nature's laws, as our Declaration of Independence says. And if you want your society to survive, to continue, and more importantly, to prosper, you have to figure out what those laws are, and you have to conduct your nation's business, whether it's the economy, whether it's your culture, or anything, in keeping with those universal principles. That's the whole point of a republic. When Benjamin Franklin said, "I've given you a republic if you can keep it," what does that mean? You know, does it just mean that we stay armed and fight the bad guys whenever we have to? No, it means that we have to constantly hold ourselves to the test. How does the universe work? What are God's laws? How do they manifest themselves in terms of science, in terms of technology, in terms of culture? And are we then conducting our activity as individual citizens or part of a body politic from that standpoint? What's the contrary view, the one we fought against? The imperial system says men are simply animals. And, you know, the more powerful are the ones with the bluer blood. They get to set the rules, they get to control everything, and they get to deal with us as will, including culling the herd when necessary. Those are two contrary images of man. And fundamentally, I don't believe there's any fight that we're facing in the United States of America that we can't win if we are consciously fighting from the standpoint of man in the image of the Creator. And really put yourself to the test in terms of what does that mean? How does that manifest itself in terms of questions like economics? If man is in the image of the Creator and the universe is a constant process of unfolding creation, shouldn't that be the basis of your economic policy, not money? You know, as one example. This is what I mean by actually putting yourself to the test in terms of what these principles represent. And that is what anybody and everybody can do right now. Whether we have a crappy Supreme Court or a horrible Senate or Dominion voting machines, that is what you can do right now. And then conduct yourself for the next 100, and I think it's 25 days to the midterms, from the standpoint of winning that fight and bringing more and more people into that fight, elevating more people to actually think like citizens of a great republic. Because you do have the case, and this goes to the earlier question of communism and socialism and so on. Yes, you have enemy operatives who are out there to destroy the United States of America. They need to be fingered, they need to be exposed. Then you have a whole lot of people who just don't think, who respond on the basis of their emotions, or maybe they respond on the basis of fear because they don't see any way to change things, who can be influenced by those enemy operatives. Well, we need to expose the enemy operatives, but we need to uplift those people who are just confused or scared or not thinking. And I think the next 2 days should be a place where people think about how they can do that as we go into an absolutely extraordinary occurrence, which is this great experiment created 250 years ago, surviving for a quarter of a millennium and seeing the potential with the revival of the American system of continuing for another quarter millennium and beyond. That, I think, is, as I say, what everybody can do. And again, you can be as angry as you want against the numbskulls that we have and worse in positions of power. And we do have ways in our constitutional system to deal with them. Some of that not tomorrow. So concern yourself with what you actually can do, which I believe will then give us a giant leap going into the midterm final exam, as we've already called it, and then giving Trump more power to deal with more of these problems with at least a semi-functioning Congress.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everyone in the chat, for joining us today. I'm going to go through some more super chats here. Thank you, everyone, for all the love you send our way. It's really amazing. We couldn't have reached this level of notoriety on YouTube and increasingly in the MAGA circles without your support. So thank you very much, everyone. Danny Thompson, thank you. Unfortunately, I can't show the super stickers, but thank you very much. Please make sure you're subscribed to the channel here. Andalusian Moon, this is the one that made me laugh. Adam, love you, but the background is giving me Office Cubicle. Can we get Mount Rushmore or something? Happy 250 to Promethean Action and America. What the heck is going on with all these communists being elected? How do we reach the young, wrongly educated youth? Barbara and Susan, any thoughts on that last one? You want to give that a quick comment before we move on here?
Yeah, you reach them with actually educated youth, which we're in the process of creating. Susan has found, which I was quite happy about, she found a whole group of young people who were actually masters of none other than Henry Carey, and had been studying him independently in Michigan there for, a couple months. And they came up to her and said, hey, you're the only people who are talking about Henry Carey. Well, that means that as opposed to what you might think, there are young people out there who are studying the American system and studying us. And what has to happen is that you've got Turning Point, which has been, in a massive expansionary phase, and which, is obviously going to be deployed in terms of the midterms at this point, just as they were in 2024. So the issue really is twofold. One, in the longer term, the whole crazy educational system has to be revised, and an appropriate curriculum and teachers to teach it actually put into place. That takes a bit of time, but it doesn't mean that you don't have the cadre you need to actually do what we need to do while that is taking place. It depends on actually the people who are taking this up, becoming evangelists to their peers and saying, hey, dude, you don't know what you don't know. You think you know all sorts of things about the world, but you don't. When you say you hate the United States and you say we're all a bunch of, land grabbing, racists, and that's what the revolution was about, which is what's been taught in the schools, you have to be able to bring forward, no, that was an actual battle, and that was an imposed ideology by the British East India Company, by the French colonialists and other colonialists on the United States. That was South Carolina. It was not Hamilton's New York or Franklin's Pennsylvania. And you've got to basically really get yourself involved in that actual history of our founding fathers, the fights which were had, and the increasing perfection of this system, all right, which is, something that, you begin to feel in your bones once you actually understand it. But you got to take, if you're a young person and you're studying this stuff and you're following it as us, your job is to go out there among your fellows and basically say and argue passionately with them about the nature of the United States. We're on a journey of increasing perfection. There are things which will cause also a leap of understanding in terms of cultural optimism. Elon Musk and going to space will cause a leap in optimism in this generation and intrigue their imaginations, which have sort of been, if you think about this ideology which has been foisted on people, it just freezes the brain. It's very emotionally unappealing. It doesn't excite that quality in you which makes you human. If you imagine your future, you can easily read 1984 by George Orwell and see yourself sitting in that environment if these people keep control. So I think that's the answer. It's a very broad question because there's two things. One is the rotten educational system, and two is the people who've already revolted from that and are already committed to this and now have a mission to actually bring their colleagues and a whole generation along. And unfortunately, you know, the media, which Dr. Trump actually addressed at the beginning of all this, is central to changing all of it. Because, you know, these social networks are actually quite poisonous.
Adam, I saw up in the chat some people asking questions about Henry Carey. So I'm going to share with people a resource they can go to. This is our Promethean Action website, and this is a pamphlet entitled Bye Bye Globalism, The American System is Back. And I don't have the last back page of the pamphlet, but the back page of the pamphlet is a wonderful quote by Abraham Lincoln's economic advisor, whose name was Henry Carey. I want to make a recommendation in the course of your reflections on the American, on our 250th anniversary. Go to the Promethean Action website, get this pamphlet. It's short, read it. It gives you a quick review of what the American system is, and more importantly, it puts in the words of the members of our administration, President Trump, Jameson Greer, J.D. Vance, and others, discussions of our true American heritage, the American system. So I saw a lot in the chat asking about that, and I wanted to give people that kind of assignment.
So everyone, if you go to the Promethean Action website, just search for Promethean Action or the links in the description. If you go to our website, there's going to be a banner at the top. That's where you can download the pamphlet that Susan was showing you. And it's completely free. You just have to you can just be a free subscriber to our newsletter and you'll get access to our latest pamphlet. So everyone can definitely check that out. I just want to say, final thank you for your comment about the background. These backgrounds that I use are actually from Apple's campus. This is the Apple default background, but I picked this one because it matches the color of my eyes so well. But I have another Mount Rushmore background that I'm in the process that my AI is generating for me. Thank you very much for your comment, and so love having every one of you guys here joining us every week. Thank you very much. I'd say thank you to Work For It Patriot. Love your little doggo there. Thank you for joining us. Please make sure you're getting our free newsletter. The link is in the description. Thank you. 613 says, always a breath of fresh air. Thank you. Thank you for joining us for this very special America 250 show. Make sure you're subscribed to our newsletter. And okay, what I'm going to do, here's some more super stickers. Thank you, Carol Sunday. I can't show the super sticker. Thank you. Thank you, Devon. Thank you. Happy 250 anniversary to all. Thank you very much. And I'm going to get to the next set of questions here, which is also on the Supreme Court topic. This time it was a ruling of the Save America Act. So let me just pull up two super chat questions here. The first one is from D. Knight. There will come a day that we will have secure elections and we will see how small a minority the Democratic voters actually are. I agree, tend to agree. And Slab Pizza 1 says, yeah, but if we had election integrity, would these communists really be winning? And so I'm gonna take the questions here from our email newsletter, which pertain to this, which is all about election integrity and the SAVE Act, which is also another ruling that the Supreme Court did earlier this week. So one says, how do you feel about Barrett's ruling? What can we do now besides pass the Save America Act? Thank you, Juan. Zach says, I thought the election Thoughts on election security and fraud, e.g. the Save America Act, recent reports from Lindell and the Election Crime Bureau regarding the AWEB organization and the 2020 American organization, and allegations made by Ryan Hartwig. Okay. So generally, yes, thoughts on election security and fraud in the Save America Act. Renee says, what is the best tactic to get the SAVE Act done before midterms to save our country? And Linda finally says here, Trump just called the Save America Act non-passage a national emergency. Is he bringing that terminology out so that we are familiar with it? So when the Save America Act doesn't pass, he will formally call it a national emergency and act accordingly. I'm not exactly certain that's the way it works. So thank you, Linda, for your thoughts and for your question. Barbara and Susan.
Well, I think that you constantly have to go back to November of 2024. And you have to think about the fact that we had the fraud mechanisms, which we already all know about, in place, and yet we still won. And we won by making it too big to rig. And we're going to have to pull that off in terms of the midterms again. That has to be the primary thing we're thinking about. Turning out the vote for Donald Trump and his agenda is the main thing we have to do in massive, massive numbers. All right. Now, that said, we'll just have to see how this all pans out in the Congress. Clearly, everybody should be on their phones with their congressman or representative and giving them hell. It just has to become overwhelming that, we think you're being deficit in terms of your responsibilities to the republic. We're beginning to think you're all traitors. If you don't pass this thing, it's pretty damn simple. But at the same time, the issue of Plan B is what's Plan B, okay, in terms of actual election integrity measures. Well, the administration's acting on that. The Postmaster General just came out with a statement saying he ain't, basically mail-in ballots to any states that refuse to clean up their voter rolls. A very interesting perspective. Who owns Dominion voting right now? Is it still the people who owned it in 2020? No, it turns out a whole new ownership led by a former election administrator who's a Republican from St. Louis. Interesting, isn't it? So you see that there are other things being done in terms of Plan B. The Justice Department is doing civil rights suits up the wazoo, essentially demanding the voting rolls from these blue states, using the Civil Rights Act to say, we have permission to ensure that there are clean elections under the Constitution. We want your voter rolls, and we're going to examine them based on Social Security numbers. What about the Democratic turnout machine? Well, it turns out that actually the Democratic turnout machine is largely congruent, exactly the same machine that the J.D. Vance fraud task force is going after right now and putting the key culprits under indictment and in jail. So there's a lot being done, all right, besides the Save America Act. The Save America Act obviously is primary, and we have to put every single bit of pressure on that. But if indeed Congress flops, is the answer, we all go get our guns and basically say we're in a civil war? That's what is a lot of what is being pushed on social media at this point, unfortunately. The answer is no. You get your hands and your feet and you round up every single person you know to vote for Donald Trump, regardless of who the Republican candidate is in the midterm elections. That's our immediate, victory, which we have to deliver. So that's what I'd have to say.
Yeah, and I just want to drill down on that because again, there's a phenomenon, especially in the social media world, where you kind of let your anxieties, fly free. But which maybe there's a certain healthy aspect to getting it out of your system. I don't know. But I think you always have to ask yourself the question, what is it I can actually do? rather than opining my opinion with capital letters and exclamation points. And again, there might be some mental health aspect to this or not, because I think the real question is, what can I do? Somebody up in the chat earlier made the point that the voter turnout in one of these New York elections where the Democratic Socialist / Communist won was 10%, right? So what if we carry out a robust get out the vote effort among the MAGA base, among, Republicans who, even if some of them are not MAGA, they're obviously don't want some of this other crap in there when it comes to November. We have to carry out the biggest get out the vote operation that we have ever seen before. I am absolutely convinced that that is the key to the midterm. The midterms are based on voter turnout. And since Donald Trump is not officially on the top of the ticket, I can tell you that the Trump administration is making sure that his ideas will be at the top of the ticket. I was at an event here in Michigan a couple of weeks ago, and the staffer for one of our local Republican congressmen, who's really neither here nor there, made the point, clearly they've been given their marching orders by the administration. Donald Trump is the ticket. That's what this little 22-year-old staffer said. Donald Trump is the ticket, which is, of course, what we've been saying for over 2 years now. So Trump and Trump's revolution is what is going to drive people. It's also just been announced that the Republican Party will hold a midterm convention in Dallas a couple of days after Labor Day in September to fire up the base. And if you saw Trump's truth on it, he said, I want to bring innovators and manufacturers and people who are unleashing the next era of American economy to showcase that, because that is going to be the message. So I think what people have to think about is, again, what can you do personally, which doesn't, again, involve capital letters and exclamation points. What can you do? And I think you can do two things. Master the American system so that you can help spread the word on that. Use the resources we provide you, and in a minute we'll show you the Promethean PAC resources that are available to you. But number two, find an organization which is doing a get out the vote operation. Turning Point is one of them, and they have task forces. They have task forces for, religious, getting out the religious vote, because in the past, although it's changed somewhat, a lot of evangelicals didn't used to vote. I think that's changing. And I think that's in part because you've had a concerted effort by groups like Turning Point. They've got farm task forces. Other people like Scott Pressler have task forces reaching out to hunters who, oddly enough, didn't vote that much, and so on. There's a huge amount that people can do as we go into this process in terms of this absolutely vital question of getting out the vote and making it too big to rig. Because please, for all the people who sit there and say, well, if we don't get the SAVE Act through, it's, we've lost, it's out the window. And, they didn't get rid of counting mail-in ballots 5 days after the election. It's lost. It's out I'm sorry, we had all of that in 2024 and we still won. And we weren't, and we had Joe Biden sitting in the White House. And we had a Justice Department that was in enemies' hands, and we still won. So, I don't have a lot of tolerance for these people who say, well, unless we have a perfectly clean election, I'm not going to vote. I just don't understand where their head is. You're in a live fire war. The enemy is shooting bullets at you. And yeah, it's nice if you can get rid of some of their bullets, but if you can't, you damn well still better figure out how to win. And we do it as we did in 2024, overwhelm them.
Thank you, Susan. My new background. Thank you, Susan. And thank you to, I know I know that half of this entire webcast is me just saying the words, thank you. But again, we can't do any of this without you. Let me take some more super chats here because some people have some really insightful things to say. And yes, after we get through the super chat, the next set of official questions we're going to take will be on the Muslim and Islam and the Muslim Brotherhood question. That's definitely coming up next. So let me get some more super chats here and say thanks and let some people express what they're thinking. This is actually a big question that I really wanted to address this one. I know it's already come up a little bit more, but we should take it again. What's a rational, coherent way to explain everything to normies? Even friends who are doomers now, right? I assume maybe, I don't know how old you are, but the doomer thing is super big in the millennials. The Generation Xers, the Generation Xers, the millennials, they're super doomers. Friends who have become doomers, my Trump voting pals are pretty checked out right now, probably spending too much time on these wacky social media things. Barbara and Susan, your comments, because this is like such an essential question for all of our viewers.
Well, first you got to figure out why they checked out. Many of my colleagues in the boomer generation checked out. And the way I always found to get under their skin was to ask them precisely that question. Why did you decide to give up everything you were fighting for? Why did you decide that? And you can't really address it because the Psy war has been so intense, particularly on this generation, regarding Israel, regarding Charlie Kirk's assassination, regarding all of these things, regarding the Epstein stuff, that, what the Psy war is intending to do is to kind of neutralize your forward motion, to just make you stick in the place where you were and say, okay, I'm going to go along to get along at this point, or I'm going to join the other side. That's basically the kind of frame that I see in this thing. And the only way that I see to confront it is to, first of all, show them something which nobody is talking about, namely our history and the American system and what Trump is doing, not just in terms of the Middle East, but in terms of the whole apparatus which gave us COVID, which tried to assassinate him. That's the climate which was actually going on at the point that the 2024 elections happened. When you go back and actually think about it, people were coming out of the most extreme expression of what these guys want to implement on the world. The presidential candidate was almost assassinated. And he stood up and he said, fight, fight, fight. Something which became iconic and which impassioned many people to find out more. Why did he do that? Why didn't he just stop and say, okay, you got me. I'm not willing to give up my life for this mission. No, that's not what he said. He said, I'm out here to inspire you. Even if I die, my last words to you are what? Fight, fight, fight. So, you have to figure out with each person, and they're all individuals, so they all come at you differently. Why did you change? What is it specifically that, think about it seriously and tell me, what is it specifically that has you, essentially stopping your forward progress at this point? And let me address that. And then you got to be prepared to address it. But I think already from talking to people what the key social media nonsense doomer stuff. It's actually in your question. What the doomers are actually saying, and you have to get at why you would fall for that. And that's really, it's a Socratic conversation. I can't give you a line to say, okay, here's the bomb you throw and that's going to change everything. Because obviously people have succumbed to something which is very powerful and hits them emotionally in terms of who they are in a certain way. And you've got to come back and actually rebuild that identity, which was actually moving forward.
Yeah, Adam, could you share the screen? I want to read a quote which is on our half-page flyer, because I think it addresses this in a certain way. What we're showing you is our current Promethean PAC's current half-page flyer, again, to clarify for people. Promethean Action, which is hosting this show, is our policy arm, but we do have a political action committee, which has its own separate website, Promethean PAC, which is intervening directly into the elections. This is our current half-page flyer. We actually are in the process of creating a new one, a more up-to-date version of this. But the reason I pulled this up is I want to read this quote from Treasury Secretary Bessent, which is right in the middle of it. He said, the Democrats had this strategy called compensate the loser. And I think that's very important, because what happens with many people that you're talking to is they've fallen back into a mindset where they feel they have no power, whether it's economically, as Bessent is reflecting here, the democratic globalist British policies over a series of decades took away many people's ability to take care of themselves. The traditional blue-collar jobs where one income could raise a family got gutted by NAFTA and a whole series of policies over the past 30, 40 years. So you have a whole layer of the American population which feels somewhat helpless in terms of being able to control their economic future or much of their future at all. And so what do the Democrats do? You accept your loser status, and they throw money or drugs or gambling or whatever it is they're going to throw at you to keep you pacified. But what does Bessent say? He says, I don't think the bottom 50% of Americans are losers. The system hasn't worked for them. They are winners. It's just a bad system. So we are going to have to fix the system. And I think that's sort of what's missing when we get stuck in one of these discussions with people where they're extremely pessimistic, doomer, whatever version of this is. They've somehow fallen back into the idea that they don't have any power, and all they can do is be angry or throw bombs at political bombs, not real bombs, at a particular issue that they seem like nobody's doing anything about. And they're missing this fundamental point. It was this entire system itself. It was the surrender of the United States to the British economic system over the course, slowly at the beginning of the 20th century and then accelerating by the end. And it's that system which has given people this sense of powerlessness or anger. And if all you're doing is just being angry inside that system, you're kind of stuck. So somehow, and it's a challenge, and there's no magic way to do it because it's a different discussion probably with different people. But how do you get them to recognize that they're simply trapped in a system which is a failed system, and there aren't solutions within that system, but that this administration is approaching it from a completely different standpoint? Both, and it's what I said at the outset, from the standpoint of economics and from the standpoint of foreign policy. This administration is breaking from the British imperial system in a way that you have not seen in over 100 years. This is really big. Now, if the person you're talking to doesn't even know that what we're fighting is the British imperial system, doesn't even know that the American system gives you all the tools you need to actually fight it, well, then they're going to have all of these kinds of loser, victim, surrender, anger, approaches to the thing. So I always say that it's a question of identity. When you're dealing with somebody who's in one of these trapped states of mind, their identity has shriveled into being a loser or a victim or whatever. And you have to give them the tools again to see that they actually have power to act in the world because of what our founding fathers gave us, and because we got a guy sitting in the White House who's got the biggest balls I've ever seen.
Indeed, Susan, isn't that the truth? Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Barbara, and thank you to everyone in the chat. I have to ask Micah's question. Micah, I see you in the chat. Thank you very much for your support. She said, headed to DC to pass out Promethean flyers on Independence Day. Woo! Thank you. The goal is to hand out all 500. Oh, you'll go through. Man, I used to do a lot of leafleting in DC in the early 2000s. If you put your mind to it, you can get out 500 really pretty easily. Thank you so much. That'd be so awesome. But she had some more. She actually had a question here that I wanted to get to. She also said, this channel is really growing. I pray for you all find some really good help to make good content. Yes, I'm working with a few people right now. But here's her honest question. I think Barbara might have some thoughts on this. I think this is important because this is part of the wider discussion that's happening on the internet. Emerging research into MLK has exposed this Marxist ideology, and Martin Luther King's father being a student of the Frankfurt School. With the current contrived racial tensions, can we neutralize this internal conflict? Would love to see a Promethean collab with Chad O. Jackson. Thank you very much, Micah, for your honest question. Barbara, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, you first have to actually, if you're going to judge Martin Luther King, you got to read Martin Luther King. That's my first, basic idea. There's all sorts of stuff floating around about Martin Luther King. Much of it generated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation during COINTELPRO. Much of it somewhat true. He had a sexual appetite. A lot of people have one. The downfall of many people who are in the realm of philosophy and politics, etc. But his philosophy is carried forward in his speeches. He was an extraordinarily educated individual in the classics. And you cannot read his actual writings without hearing Plato, without hearing the Greeks, without hearing the most fundamental, and most particularly hearing Augustine, and hearing the most fundamental, Christian ideas. And you look at that once you actually understand it, and you look at all of the stuff which has been put forward about him. Yes, there were communists in the NAACP and SCLC. Yes, the civil rights movement in many respects had an intellectual class which was very much influenced by the Frankfurt School. But does that mean that heroic struggle, which is what it was, to actually bring forward a clear right to vote, a clear emancipation, in terms of economics of the Black population? I'm not talking about what happened under Johnson with the welfare programs and everything else. I'm talking about Martin Luther King, all right? And that's a hell of a lot different. Look at all the things which were then thrown at that fundamental thing he said. I want my sons and daughters to be judged by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. I want them to be judged by their merit. Now, I happen to have a Black family on one side, and that is what really motivated the children of a steel worker at Bethlehem Steel in Baltimore, Pennsylvania, to actually cause 10 kids to be educated at the highest possible level, was the inspiration of Dr. King. That was not Stokely Carmichael, the Black Power movement, everything else that came along to actually subvert that movement. And, I think you got to know a little bit more of the history before, we start making judgments on Dr. King. And most importantly, you got to read Dr. King. You got to see what the man actually said. You got to see what his philosophy was all about. But, that was a period where, you basically, and I lived through it, so I'm pretty familiar with his content, and so does Susan. That was a period where you had a great awakening of the Black population in the United States. And it was all subverted by something called the Black Power movement, which actually rejected everything King had to say about the pathway which the civil rights movement had to take. So that's where I'd leave that question. There's a lot of stuff floating around, but if you want to go after somebody, go after Stokely Carmichael, go after the Black Power movement. Look at the transition which Malcolm X was actually making, and understand, you know, those currents for what they're actually about, as opposed to people who, without doing that reading, actually want to opine on what somebody said on social media or what have you. I don't think that you can reject any of those premises, and I think it really led to, you know, a fundamental change in the United States, which was fought for with blood and with dedication, and with the idea that Martin Luther King did give his life. He did go to the mountaintop. He died for a cause which was very important.
Thank you, Barbara. I am not a huge student of MLK. I haven't read a lot of his writings, but I do know for a fact that he was a student of Plato, an avowed student of the Republic. And anyone who's read the Republic all the way through and has devoted their life to studying that work deserves a lot of respect. So I definitely lead with what Barbara has to say. You need to read his work and understand who he was. Susan, any comments on this? Because you know, you lived through this time period too.
Well, I lived through it, and let's remember that period was punctuated by 3 very major assassinations, although if you want to throw Malcolm X in there, you've got 4. You have the assassination of John Kennedy in 1963, and then within 2 months of each other in 1968, you had Martin Luther King and you had Bobby Kennedy. And I think what that did, and I want to address, in a sense, the subjective side of this, because it gets back to what I was saying about people's identity. As I've said before, people probably know, I was campaigning for Bobby Kennedy Sr. I was with the campaign officially in San Francisco in 1968, the night he was shot in Los Angeles. And I saw many of my friends in the wake of that retreat, become very, very little, and never stopped being little over the next 50, 60 years. I saw other people become little, and then they kind of came back to life when Donald Trump came along, because there you suddenly had somebody who was standing up to these same evil forces who do assassinate anybody who is a threat to them. And I think the people who are, pushing some of this stuff on Martin Luther King really ought to ask themselves the question why he was assassinated, by precisely the same deep state networks that killed JFK and RFK. Because people who lift people up to rediscover their American identity, their human identity, this is the real threat to the empire. The empire wants us to be little. The empire wants us to be losers or afraid or angry or victims with, and just lashing out at what's going on. And that's obviously the whole ideology of, much of the Democratic Party at this point. As Besant said, you're all losers, and, we'll just try and pacify you. But it's the figures who lift people up, who challenge them to actually act as citizens of a great republic, which gets back to the Plato question. Because the whole challenge of Plato's Republic is not what people say in terms of some formula and, golden souls and all of this, these formulas that people get stuck in the first part of Plato's Republic. Plato's Republic essentially asserts the challenge that we as mere mortals will never perfectly understand God, the universal, the creator. And, Plato is very clear in there. There is one creator. Forget about the Greek pantheon. And that the challenge of a republic is to create leaders who are devoted to constantly understanding the universe less imperfectly. It'll never be perfect, but it'll be less imperfect. That is a huge challenge, which is why the Republic is so challenging to read. And I recommend people read it more than once. And please don't read somebody's description of it. And get to the end. Don't stop halfway through because you're going to miss the punchlines. That's the challenge of leadership. And believe me, when the empire sees somebody who does that, who is constantly challenging themselves to change, and I think an example of this is Vice President Vance. And a lot of people say, oh, well, look at his background, or look at his ties, or look at this. I mean, if you choose to believe that everything he says is a lie, I can't help you. But, if you just look at his journey, the fact that he's constantly re-examining, why did I think that? What effect did that have basically on my soul? And, that constant re-examination and challenging himself, and I believe other people, to constantly re-examine, why do I think the way I think? And is it commensurate with what is needed to save our civilization? Whenever you get a leader who sparks that, and it may be a leader where you may not agree with a particular thing that he's fighting for, or a particular policy, but that is the biggest threat to the control of the imperial elite. And we just need more people who are willing to take up that challenge of constantly re-examining their own relationship to the universe and asking, do I know why I think what I think? Where are my ideas coming from? What is the impact of my ideas on the real world? What impacted my idea? Let me look back at what I thought 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And were those ideas actually appropriate to what history needed? I think that is one of the most essential qualities of true and real leadership. And as I say, that is the biggest threat. And I think if you look throughout history at the people who are assassinated or persecuted, there are people who actually have that quality. And we need a whole lot more people like that.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Barbara. And thank you, everyone, for waiting. I'm realizing now I'm just getting to the issue of the Muslim Brotherhood and Islam. So thank you, everyone, for being locked in here with us. Before we get to the Islam stuff, I just have to say a few more thank yous. First off, I want to apologize to Micah. Promethean would certainly benefit from Chad O. Jackson's research. Okay, we'll have to look into that. Thanks for taking my question. Love your work. Also, I'm a guy. So very sorry, brother. That's just part of the internet, I guess. Thank you very much for your support. If you know Chad or know him and you can put him in touch, maybe we can get on the show. Thank you very much. And I want to take one more here. I have plenty of other super chats. I see you in the super chat, Ben. I also see you in the super chat here. But I want to say thank you to this guy, Texas Hiker. I shouldn't assume if it's a guy or girl. This person, Texas Hiker. Okay. I don't think I've seen you here in the chat before, so thank you very much. I wish you all the success because as an AP government and politics and an AP macroeconomics teacher and somebody who grew up in Virginia Beach, this all makes sense. I've only watched you for 3 days and all of this lines up. Thank you. This is why I think the algorithm, these social media algorithms can be a great blessing for the world because they put us in touch with so many people like yourself that me standing on the street corner, I'd never be able to reach any of you guys, but us making videos here, this allows us to reach such an amazing amount of people. Please make sure you're getting our free newsletter. The link for our free newsletter is in the description. If you would like to become a sustaining contributor for like $10 a month, again, subscribe to our newsletter. When you subscribe, you'll be prompted with a potential, you can subscribe free or you can subscribe for $10 a month. Just subscribe for free. Let us stay in contact with you. And we have both a daily and a weekly subscription where I do have a plan to turn our email list into a standalone product, like a standalone political product. So join now. That way, as I begin to improve this whole email process, you'll be able to take part in it. So Thank you very much, Texas Hiker. Okay, now for what I promised like an hour ago. I'm going to take some questions here on the Muslim Brotherhood and Islam as a whole, because we get so many questions. And actually, let me scroll through here, because I think I even got some super chats about this. So let me see if I can roll some of these up in here. Okay. Yes, here's one I know I got for sure. All right, so let me pull this one up. Paul Clark Fitness says, Islam has 3 tiers: 1, religious freedom excuse; 2, get elected and change laws and degrade the West; 3, drive out or take out opposition, including crimes. How do we get control of this? Okay, I'm gonna roll this in with 3 other questions here. So this first one is from, I think it's Danae. Your views on the Muslim Brotherhood agenda for America and indeed the entire planet. I have not heard any mention of this subject on any of your podcasts. Why? Do you deem it as unimportant? It is an absolute emergency. We actually, I don't think we've actually formally covered this, maybe only once or twice obliquely in our things. So we'll answer it here. Mary says, what are your thoughts about the Muslim Islamic situation, and do you feel that we will be taken over by this ideology? And Thomas says, thinking you all are downplaying the impact of Islam on the American system and their belief in a global system of Islam. Why are they tied to the British? Why are they tied to the British imperial system or vice versa? Interested in your thoughts. Thank you, Thomas. So we got so many questions, and people were even sending in questions when I was setting up the show this morning. I had some lady send in a question on the thing here talking about Dearborn, because I even saw some video clips that were supposed stuff that was going on in Dearborn. So we even got a question about Dearborn right before the show started. So Barbara and Susan.
I'm going to let Barbara start on the origins of the Muslim Brotherhood, if that's where she was going to start.
Yeah, that's what we'll start with. I mean, I think we posted, and you know, if not, I think, Adam, you might want to pull some things out of your latest piece that you actually did on this for our paid subscribers on Promethean Action, to give people something of our doing. I can't remember where we are in that process, but our doing on that, because essentially, you know, the Muslim Brotherhood is an invention of British intelligence. And it was invented to, you know, it's not necessarily have anything to do with the traditional Islamic religion. All right. This is a specific ideology which came out of what was called the Arab Bureau at Cambridge University. It was forwarded by, you know, people like Bernard Lewis, Zbigniew Brzezinski in the United States, most recently by Barack Obama, you know, and its whole aim was we can control the Middle East by setting these fundamentalist religious warfare in motion, Jews versus Muslims. And the Muslims who will pick up this will be those who actually believe in the Muslim Brotherhood program. We will use these Muslims to defeat any Muslim or Arab in the Arab world who is actually seeking to establish a nationalist nation state, not based on religion and not based on permanent warfare with Israel. That, in a nutshell, is the origins of the Muslim Brotherhood. It is a state intelligence created ideological front, which now has permeated into the traditional Islamic religion. Many people in the Islamic religion oppose it violently. Its most recent insurrection or you know, coming into being was led by Barack Obama, who overthrew the Mubarak government in Egypt because he said or believed that the Muslim Brotherhood could be a stabilizing influence in the Middle East, i.e. a terrorist tool could be a stabilizing Middle East actor. For whom? Whom is the Muslim Brotherhood acting? You have to ask yourself that question every single time. That said, all right, and I've just given you sort of the outline of the history. What you have now, and it's being used as yet another kind of catalyst to break apart, in my view, the coalition which actually elected Donald Trump president in 2024. You're being taught that the Muslim Brotherhood is, all the questions here talk about goals of the Muslim Brotherhood, all right, the actual goals of the Muslim Brotherhood, which are being confronted with by those people who are now using this to try and fracture the MAGA coalition, is the idea that the Muslim Brotherhood is what Islam is. That is not true. Now, we can talk about what Islam is and whether it's a great religion or not. I think that's really a discussion in the civics domain, where it becomes an urgent discussion is what it is in terms of politics. And, Muslims constitute 1.5% or something like that of the US population. So think about that accurate fact and think about how much this thing has got people riled up. And think about the fact that were it not for the Muslim vote, and Susan can tell you this story, in Michigan, Donald Trump would probably not be president of the United States. So that's kind of how I put the issue. You've got to actually understand the history of the Muslim Brotherhood, where it came from. It's not necessarily, part and parcel of the Islamic religion. It has taken over in a supported way what was the Shiite faction of the Muslim religion in Iran. The most recent Ayatollah of Iran was not Ayatollah Khomeini, who had a very different view of Islam. Khamenei was actually a believer in the same philosophy as the Muslim Brotherhood. And that tells you something about the IRGC currently and other things. And these things evolve, they change. But you got to actually understand that this isn't some phenomenon within the Islamic religion. This formation, i.e. a terrorist form of Islam, has been used by intelligence agencies, starting with our fulfilled use of them in Afghanistan to defeat the Soviets. So they had two reasons why this faction was created. First was to defeat any nationalist leader within the Arab world from actually creating a secular state. And the second was to actually try and use them to create a war on the flank of the Soviet Union on the border right there with Afghanistan, and to spread that throughout Eurasia to overcome the Soviet Union. That's the history. The people who actually, are in the Muslim Brotherhood framework in Islam are the very same people who supported Hitler during World War II. It's an interesting history, but it comes from British intelligence as its originator, backed by the people who were called the Arabists, like Lawrence of Arabia. You may be familiar with that name, in British intelligence. And that's where I'll end my answer.
Okay, actually, let's do this. So I think something that our audience really likes that we don't do enough of is start giving book references. So Barbara, one of the books that you mentioned I think is important for people to get some perspective is actually Huntington's A Clash of Civilizations. Here, let me pull this up for everyone, because I think it's a really important thing to get a sense of, for people to get a sense of where some of this modern Islam political relationship comes from, and the plan to build this clash of civilizations that we see building up. But what are some other books, Barbara, that people could read in order to get a better sense of the history of the Muslim Brotherhood?
Well, Bob Dreyfus covers it in his books. That's Dreyfuss. Robert Dreyfus. He's on Amazon. You can take a look at his books. The other person who covers it in depth from the standpoint of the actual British end of it is an author by the name of Mark Curtis.
Okay, hold on. Let me. So here's a Samuel Huntington book. So this guy,
just to be clear, yeah, on Samuel Huntington.
Yes.
And you notice a new forward by Zbigniew Brzezinski. Huntington was Huntington has got a long pedigree as a mouthpiece for the British Empire. And essentially as soon as the Soviet Union dissolved and the British no longer had the ability to play the world against each other in terms of the West versus communism, they had to come up with another enemy image. And Huntington was one of the people, along with Bernard Lewis, who was actually sort of like his higher up, to repackage the whole question that the new threat to Western civilization is Islam. Everybody who's in the chat and who's all upset about this and so on, just take a breath. If you're old enough, like I am, go back prior to 1990, and the Muslim community in Dearborn has been there since the 1950s. Very much involved in the auto industry, engineers, doctors, integrated into our society. Nobody had ever heard of Sharia law. I live 6 miles from Dearborn. I go to Dearborn. I organize in Dearborn. I have friends in Dearborn. And, prior to 1990, this was not an issue. Nobody felt threatened, because what you had at that time was the kind of traditional immigration to the United States by people from a different culture, whether it was Irish or Polish or whatever, into the United States, who then integrated into the culture and obviously kept their religions and some of their cultures, excellent food, I might add. And then you had the politicization of this and the playing up, as Barbara said, of the extremist Muslim Brotherhood side of this. Yes, when you start importing people into a nation who then represent that outlook, and that is obviously what they are doing in Europe and Britain on a much, much larger scale than we've seen in the United States. But in terms of this, it's no different than the other groups that were channeled into the United States by the Biden administration and by others. Different groups brought in to overwhelm a community, overwhelm a culture, and create these kinds of problems. But I think people have to at least make themselves somewhat literate in terms of the actual history of this. And so, that was Samuel Huntington and Bernard Lewis were part of the British operation to elevate the Muslim Brotherhood, which they created, as the threat, which you are now aware of. The book that Adam is now showing is another book by Mark Curtis. This is largely written from the standpoint of British intelligence community archives. You cannot argue with this book, in terms of its actual sourcing. So I think people have to, and again, it is not to discount the fact that the enemies of this nation are taking the Muslim Brotherhood version of Islam, and it is a threat. And it's much more, as I say, much more obvious when you look at the way they've done it in Europe. We would have been there if it were not for Trump closing the borders, and obviously identifying how they do it in particular communities like the Somalis in Minnesota. All of this is real, but it is not the same thing as the third generation Muslim here in Michigan, who has integrated into American society, has served in the military. As Barbara said, maybe one of your criteria, are you willing to die for your country? Yeah, well, a lot of American Muslims that I know are not only willing to, but they actually have. If people remember we lost a bunch of soldiers prior to Iran they were hit in Syria. They were in a base in Syria. And one of them was a gentleman from Michigan, you know, who's a Muslim, who was one of the 6 or 7 who actually died in that attack. So people should just make themselves a little bit more literate in terms of how this is unfolded and what the process is. And as Barbara said, look, let's go back to vote fraud, okay? You know, people can get their hair on fire all they want on vote fraud. I'm in Wayne County, Michigan, where vote fraud is legendary. We know the role that Michigan played in the 2000 election steal at Huntington Place. That's where they count the votes for Wayne County in Michigan. And everybody knows, they saw the pictures, you know, they were bringing in the boatloads of absentee ballots in white vans in the basement of Huntington Place. And the Republican election inspectors were locked out, and they put pizza boxes on the windows so you couldn't see what they were doing and so on. They stole the election in Michigan in 2020 at Huntington Place. And a lot of that apparatus was still in place in 2024. But why did they call Michigan at 11 o'clock on election night? Not with ballots that were still out there that could have come in for the next 4 or 5 days. They called Michigan for Donald Trump on election night because Wayne County, Michigan moved more votes into the Republican column over 2020 than any county in the United States, with the exception of Maricopa County, Arizona. I was there, and those votes came from blue-collar workers and Muslims in Dearborn Heights, and Hamtramck, who supported and still support Donald Trump.
Thank you, Susan. I just want to make sure that everyone here sees this last book. So I had the book from Huntington. I had Secret Affairs by Mark Curtis, which goes into the kind of British side. This is Devil's Game. Dreyfus here talks more about the American side of this. Barbara, you even mentioned before, Robert Dreyfus was part of our extended organization in the past, right?
That's true. It's not to comment on the book, which is very good, but, you know, we got hit with the same kind of, government operation that the civil rights movement got hit with, and a lot more ferocity. And a lot of people at that point said, hey, I'm checking out. I'm going to go write books about this. I'm not going to stay in the political fight. And that's sort of what happened to a lot of people.
I just want to call out one quote here in the chat. Muslims vote Democrat. They all vote for who the Ummah tells them to. I'm sorry, it's just so ignorant. I can't stand it. I mean, I know hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of Muslims who vote Republican. So just don't say ignorant things, okay?
Unfortunately, that is the side of the internet, the anonymous side of the internet, that you have to take the good with the bad, because it allows people to explore new ideas and understand the world. But at the same time, it allows people to just be like, just say things that aren't grounded in reality, like absurd things. People say crazy stuff on the internet just because they can. So thank you everyone for tuning in. Okay, I have plenty more super chats. I have so many more questions now. I'm going to go to the H-1B question because this also came up again. And I know Trump says we're making all these jobs that are happening in various parts of the country, but the job market out there is still rough in many parts of the country. Especially for jobs now, you know, we have the moving of you know, the AI. The first thing the AI is going to take is going to be a lot of the IT jobs. And that's kind of the reshuffling we see. Now companies have fired people. Now they're bringing them back. So let's take some of these questions on the H-1B after StreamYard cooperates. Okay. So these next 3 here are going to be on the H-1B visa issue. Okay, please excuse my question regarding H-1B. I am new and learning from y'all. I recently watched another video where you called out the MAGA masses who get caught up in the little things like H-1B. I do realize there are many other evils to fight right now. It's something that concerns me and is part of the whole picture, especially where it severely impacted my son's education. And without fighting for him in the school district, and it was no small fight, he would have not have learned to read because all the resources went to English as a second language students. It was the fight of my life that I will never forget. I think for me, it was the start of opening my eyes on why the US immigration policies are so detrimental to this country. I am hopeful because of the people like you and, of course, President Trump. I pray that the next election will bring more power to his agenda. God bless you and protect you in this fight. Thank you, Kristen, for your very honest and truthful comments and observations. Okay. Rob, okay. Barbara and Susan, I love you guys. I found you back in October last year. I really respect what you're doing. I have a tough question, though, and I won't blame you if you skip it because it's uncomfortable. I like a lot of what Trump is doing, especially how he's finally helping blue-collar workers. They got betrayed for years, and it's great to see them getting jobs again. But the white-collar side of the economy is getting crushed right now. Between companies using AI as an excuse to cut staff, the H-1B program, and hiring H-1 students, did you know employers don't have access to FICA Social Security taxes for those full-time students for up to 5 years? It feels like the American professionals are getting squeezed out. I've read that H-1B workers are often paid 30 to 40% less than Americans in the same role. If your competitors are doing this to save money, why wouldn't every company follow suit? It's supposed to be complete. Seriously, and also add in February 26, found out over 300,000 degrees from India were fake and purchased. Why not charge more for H-1Bs, like 3 times the regular salary, and use that money to incentivize companies to hiring? Okay. Thank you, Rob. Yeah, I see this part here. Thank you. When a man can't pay his bills and the family finally loses hope, a lot of guys start thinking about ending it. I'm not there. I still have some savings, but burning through them and doing part-time work. I'm very sorry. I know it's real. I'm definitely in the tech world, and I'm following all the insanity that's going on around AI and tech hiring. Okay, thank you very much for your question here. Let me get on to this third one here. This is Capco. I live in a small town in Connecticut, transplanted because my husband lives here. There are many news outlets that did stories on the H-1B crisis in my town and area in Hartford, Connecticut that happened many years ago. My family was blindsided by it, but many people's jobs were taken away from them. They were forced into early retirement and then only received a retirement package if they trained somebody by video in India, who would then come to Rocky Hill, Connecticut to replace them for 30% cheaper. Trump initially was going to take care of the problems surrounding H-1 visas and then back down. It seemed like Elon was in his ear. I'm a huge Trump supporter as well as Elon. Together, they saved the First Amendment. However, even though the H-1B is not a bad law, it has been severely abused beyond imagination in this country, especially in this town. Do you see any relief from this, or will Trump do anything to make this law be used for what it was initially intended? Barbara, Susan, thank you.
Well, first of all, I have to kind of counsel patience, which I know is in short supply when you are feeling completely up against it in terms of whether you can actually provide for yourself or not. What the president is doing is putting up roadblocks to what was essentially a massively abused program under Biden. It does compensate when you actually sit down and you look at the labor force availability in certain areas of the economy. I'm not talking necessarily right now about computers. I'm talking about nurses, doctors, healthcare aides, etc. We simply, under previous administrations, And even now, still with our rotten educational system, we're not educating our people for these jobs. And so what you have is what Trump has done is he hasn't, the quotas for H-1Bs have remained the same, 85,000 under the Trump administration. Is that too many, too few? You have to look at the overall composition of the area, which, you know, right now, tech is where they're primarily based. Engineering, where we weren't training people hardly at all. And, you know, in the areas of, you know, tech and computers, all right, that's where the concentration is. And what Trump has done is require a $100,000 surcharge on every single application. He has basically increased the standards to hire outside the United States. You basically now, I believe, if you're coming from India or China, which is where these workers are primarily coming from, you have to have a master's degree. You can't just come in on what a United States, citizen would have. So he's attacking it by putting roadblocks in terms of just the open way it was done under Biden. And I suggest that a lot of what people are feeling and experiencing is the after effects of the Biden policy in large part. I haven't done the demographic analysis. It's something that really needs to be done. When I did my AI on this morning, it's an issue which is conflicted. The tech guys, the Silicon Valley guys, say we don't have enough of what we need from what's being graduated in our schools. Now, I know for a fact in medicine and in other places like that, that is true. Absolutely true in terms of filling the jobs which are opening up in healthcare. Do there need to be so many jobs in healthcare? Well, again, that's a question you have to ask in terms of how are we going to reshape that industry for the future. But you know, I think the president is very, very aware of the problem. It wasn't enforced at all under Biden. There are other things which can be done. Do we want to cut the quotas? Well, I think there has to be a fight within, the actual, that it has to be fought out. Do we have within the American population the type of people we actually need to fill these jobs in AI and not simply to fill the coder jobs? Do the Indians and the Chinese actually do it better? Well, if they do, shouldn't we steal some of their people and figure out how they were educated and implement that education here? That's, I think, part of the way the president is thinking about this. We have a labor force problem. We have people being massively educated, which is what you see out in the streets with the DSA right now. People massively educated in the social sciences, in all kinds of things which don't necessarily have to do with a job in the modern world. And you don't want to go too far over to the other side where all you're doing is STEM. But we have an enormous problem with STEM in terms of reading and math and everything else in terms of the future workforce. Are the tech guys actually laying off too many people? Well, the stats I saw this morning, yes, you have. I see that the post saying that basically they're trying to overturn this in the courts. It's being fought over, all right, and that's why I'm counseling patience on this. We will ultimately prevail in this fight because immigration law is the prerogative of the executive. And you just saw decisions this week telling these district court judges to go fly a kite in terms of other issues precisely because they had violated the prerogatives of the executive. So this is a question where you've got to think like you're the executive in charge of the whole nation. You're sitting on top of a labor force. What's it composed of? How many of your people are you going to draw off the sidelines and actually put to work in the new jobs around manufacturing? Who's willing in the younger generations to go out and farm? How are you going to incentivize that? How are you going to make it so we're not importing people to actually pick fruits at massive levels because Americans won't do it. How are you going to actually mechanize that process? That's the way I think you have to start thinking about this entire issue. And it requires patience because we're dealing with a mess.
Yeah, I want to add it from one of the, because I've been following some of the stuff in the chat in terms of people who talk about, how they watch their company bring in people at half the wages, and lay off American workers and so on. And I think, again, there's a larger systemic question which is being addressed. There's an amazing interview that J.D. Vance did with Michael Knowles a couple days ago. Barbara used a couple excerpts of it in her show yesterday. I'll probably use a few excerpts of it in my 4th of July show. But one of the points that he makes in there is that he says, and I think this is a good way to kind of begin to wrap things up because we're at the top of the hour. He says, Donald Trump has shifted the economic discussion in the United States. We are now far closer to Alexander Hamilton than...
Did you want me to play? Is this it?
Yeah, why don't you play this?
Okay. They say if a picture is worth 1,000 words, how much is a video worth?
No, I mean, this is really on the point about Catholic social teaching. This is the point of Rerum Novarum and Pope Leo XIII. He said, hold on, communism, totally awful, terrible. You can't be Catholic and communist. Every Pope since has basically said that. But also, we're not ideological laissez-faire capitalists who think we need to send our kids to the coal mines. Right. We have to put these things in their proper order. So then my question for you is, there's been a massive restructuring of what conservatism means.
The president has already completely reoriented the conversation towards what you might call an American developmentalist approach. American economic policy on the right is now much more Alexander Hamilton than it is Milton Friedman.
And what Noel said.
I do think fundamentally that Hamiltonian tradition is going to be what we see on the American right and will dominate American conservative economic thinking for the future.
Yeah,
which is not laissez-faire. It's actually much more about building the kind of tools, building the kind of infrastructure that allow human beings to flourish, that allow national and native industries to flourish at the expense of a hyper-globalized economy. And I think those are the basic principles that are going to carry us into the future. But to me, it's fundamentally about the dignity of the human person. The economy is a tool to service the dignity of the human person. If a set of economic policies make it easier for a person to raise a family, to earn a living wage, to give back to their community, to maybe go to church on Sunday, or to actually spend some leisure time building the kind of life that matters, that is the sort of thing that we want to be supportive of.
Go back to what Noel said at the outset. We don't need laissez-faire capitalism where children work in coal mines. Well, that's kind of what you're talking about in terms of the abuses of the H-1B visas, right? If the bottom line of your society is just making a ton of money and it doesn't matter what the consequences are, then you're going to have that kind of stuff. And that was rampant, we know, in Silicon Valley. Now, this administration is changing it. The change takes time, as Barbara said. But I think what people have to hang on to is what Vice President Vance just said there. This is a different economic policy. It's based not only on human dignity, but it's based, as Alexander Hamilton said, on human creativity, on the productive power of the human mind to change the universe. We have not run our economy on that basis for 125 years, not consciously on that basis. It's been kind of instinctual at parts of our history, but that is what is coming back. And that is ultimately how you're going to deal with these abuses, in the context of the specific circumstances that this administration is dealing with, where they don't run the courts, they have a crappy Congress, they're trying to do things by executive order that keep getting slapped down by judges, and then it has to be pushed to a Supreme Court, and it's a flip of a coin whether they're going to rule right or whether they're going to rule wrong. But the key thing is, And this is what we have to fight for the future. We have to make conscious this shift in the underlying economic philosophy in the United States of America. Because if we do that, we are going to work our way through the distortions, and the inequities that are still out there. But at least you're working your way through it toward a future which actually works.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you to everyone in the chat. Thank you for tuning in today. I still have like 40 something super chats that I didn't even read yet. I have like 40 more questions I didn't take. We didn't even really get to talk about Iran. I guess we'll address that next week. There's, I know, as far as I understand, the ceasefire is still holding. Before we go, maybe some final thoughts on where you guys, ladies, think what's going on with the Iran situation, just as, because I really did want to cover that. So maybe it's final thoughts about where the Iran situation's going or what's happening.
Well, right now it's holding. It is the most complex thing that any president has ever attempted, in my view, in terms of bringing peace to the Middle East for real, not in terms of a Band-Aid. And, I think that you're going to see that this is going to hold and that the president, in all probability, is not going to go back to war. He's already entertained that option over the last 48 hours and said, no, let's continue to go with diplomacy and actually ensure that Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon, but also that we end these permanent wars in the Middle East, which is the overall objective.
Yeah, I would just second that. I mean, the difference between Donald Trump's approach to the Mideast and every approach, at least for the past 30 or 40 years, is that he actually wants peace and he actually wants sovereign nations to be the viable entities in the region. And he's not playing the globalist game of moving pawns around on the chessboard. And he's trying to figure out how in Iran to get rid of the pawns, which includes the IRGC, and create the conditions where the people of that nation can actually represent their own national interests. That's difficult. It's complex. It's not going to happen if you have to bomb them back to the Stone Age, which he will do if they cannot deal with the IRGC problem ultimately. But his intention is a completely different intention than what has made this region of the world a cauldron for the past 40, 50 years or so.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Susan. Everyone this week, don't drink and drive. Don't do anything too crazy. Make sure you keep all your fingers. I love fireworks. I've almost lost my fingers several times. Make sure you come back with all your fingers. And everyone, we will see you next week. And sorry to everyone I couldn't answer your super chats. So sorry. Please. So thank you, everyone. And we'll see you next week.